The first time I heard the vows, I knew they weren't the ones my son had written. I kept smiling because everyone else was smiling, and somehow that frightened me more than the words themselves. Then she looked straight at me before reading the next line, as if she wanted to make sure I understood exactly who it was meant to hurt. My son never flinched. The pastor hesitated for the briefest second. No one stood up. No one questioned a single word. I remember wondering whether I was the only person in that church who knew something precious had just been quietly stolen. But what shook me most wasn't what she said. It was what happened after the ceremony, when someone placed a sealed envelope into my trembling hands and whispered, "You deserve to know the truth." At that moment, I realized the vows weren't changed by accident. They had been rewritten for an audience of one. Me. Looking back now, I understand that a family doesn't always fall apart because of one loud betrayal. Sometimes it begins with one carefully chosen sentence spoken in front of everyone while no one realizes they're witnessing the first crack. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I was 67 years old when my only son, Daniel, married the woman he believed was the love of his life. I had spent nearly a year helping prepare for that wedding after my husband, Richard, passed away the previous spring. Every flower arrangement, every handwritten invitation, every table setting carried a small piece of my heart because I wanted Daniel to begin this new chapter surrounded by kindness instead of grief. Losing Richard after 42 years of marriage had left an emptiness I could never fully describe. There were mornings when I still reached across the bed expecting to find his hand. There were evenings when I caught myself setting 2 coffee mugs on the kitchen counter before quietly putting one away. Helping plan Daniel's wedding became my reason to keep moving forward. It gave shape to days that otherwise felt unbearably quiet. Daniel often visited after work with drafts of his wedding vows folded neatly inside his jacket pocket. He said he wanted them to be perfect because promises should never sound rehearsed. One evening we sat together on my back porch as the sun disappeared behind the maple trees, and he read every word aloud. They weren't extravagant. They weren't poetic enough to belong in a movie. They were honest. He promised to protect his future wife, to build a home filled with patience, and to honor the family that had shaped them both. When he finished reading, he smiled the same gentle smile his father used to wear whenever he was proud of something small but meaningful. I remember touching his shoulder and saying, "Your father would have loved these words." Daniel laughed softly and folded the pages with surprising care before slipping them back into the envelope. "I'm keeping them close," he told me. "Nothing's changing between now and Saturday." I believed him with every part of my heart. If someone had told me that less than 24 hours later those very promises would disappear without a trace, I would have called it impossible. I had no idea impossible was already waiting for us at the altar. I barely slept the night before the ceremony. The envelope containing Daniel's vows remained on the kitchen table long after he had driven home, and I kept replaying every sentence in my mind. Richard used to say that promises spoken from the heart carried a weight that lasted longer than any wedding ring. Sitting alone beneath the soft glow of the dining room light, I found myself smiling through tears as I imagined him standing beside me at the church, quietly squeezing my hand whenever emotions became too much. Instead, his empty chair across from mine reminded me that this would be the first major family celebration without him. The morning arrived with clear blue skies and the gentle warmth of early autumn. I dressed slowly, fastening the pearl earrings Richard had given me on our 40th anniversary. They had become my small way of bringing him with me to important moments. When I looked into the mirror, I no longer saw the confident woman I had been years ago. I saw a widow trying her best to believe that love could still hold a family together after tremendous loss. The church was already buzzing with quiet excitement when I arrived. Florists hurried through the aisles, making final adjustments, while musicians tuned their instruments near the altar. Every arrangement looked exactly as we had planned during months of preparation. White roses lined the center aisle. Soft ivory ribbons decorated each pew. Daniel had wanted everything elegant but simple because, as he often said, people should remember the marriage, not the decorations. Guests greeted me warmly, thanking me for organizing such a beautiful celebration. I accepted every compliment with a grateful smile, although each kind word made me miss Richard even more. He would have noticed every tiny detail, from the polished wooden pews to the scent of fresh flowers drifting through the sanctuary. A few minutes before the ceremony, Daniel found me standing near a stained glass window. His tuxedo fit perfectly, but beneath his calm expression I recognized the nervous little boy who used to ask me whether I thought he could handle his first day of school. He wrapped me in a hug that lasted longer than usual. "Thank you for everything, Mom," he whispered. "I could never have done this without you." I kissed his cheek and straightened his tie, just as I had done before every graduation, every job interview, and every important milestone in his life. "Your father would be so proud of the man you have become," I said quietly. His eyes glistened for just a moment before he smiled. "I hope so." Then Olivia appeared at the far end of the hallway with two bridesmaids. She looked stunning in her gown, and every guest who passed by admired her elegance. She greeted me politely, but something about her smile felt carefully measured rather than warm. It lasted only a second before she asked one of the wedding coordinators for the folder containing the ceremony script. I noticed her stepping aside with the pastor while they quietly reviewed a few pages together. At first I assumed they were making harmless last-minute adjustments. Weddings often required small changes. Still, I found it strange that Daniel was not included in the conversation. Before I could think much more about it, the music began to play. The guests stood together, the sanctuary filled with hopeful anticipation, and I took my seat in the front row believing I was about to witness the same heartfelt promises my son had trusted me with only the evening before. The ceremony unfolded with the quiet grace everyone expected. Soft piano music drifted through the sanctuary as Olivia walked slowly toward the altar, her smile calm and confident. Daniel looked at her with unmistakable admiration, and for a few beautiful minutes I allowed myself to believe that every difficult season our family had endured was finally leading us toward something hopeful. Pastor Michael welcomed everyone with a warm voice that echoed gently through the church. He spoke about commitment, patience, and the importance of building a marriage on honesty. I noticed him glance down at the folder in his hands more than once. It was subtle, almost impossible to catch, but there was a hesitation that had not been there during the rehearsal. At the time I assumed he was simply being careful not to lose his place. Then the moment arrived for the personal vows. Daniel reached into his jacket and unfolded the pages I had watched him protect so carefully the evening before. Every word sounded exactly as I remembered. He thanked Olivia for believing in him during difficult years. He promised to protect her dreams as fiercely as his own. He spoke about creating a home where forgiveness would always be stronger than pride. When he finished, many guests quietly wiped away tears. I did not look at Olivia. I looked at the folded pages in Daniel's hands because I knew they were genuine. Then Olivia accepted her own pages from the pastor. Before speaking, she turned her head ever so slightly toward the front row. Our eyes met for only an instant. There was no smile this time. Only a calm expression that I could not quite understand. Her first few sentences sounded perfectly natural, filled with gratitude and affection. Then everything shifted. She spoke about beginning a new life where outside voices would never influence their decisions. She promised that together they would leave behind every expectation placed upon them by previous generations. Several guests nodded approvingly, interpreting the words as a declaration of independence. But I knew those sentences had never appeared in the draft Daniel had proudly shared with me. My heart began beating so loudly that I barely heard the next line. She promised that from that day forward they would create their own family first, without obligation to anyone who expected a place at the center of their marriage. Again she looked directly toward me before lowering her eyes back to the page. No one else seemed to notice. Daniel continued smiling, completely unaware that anything had changed. Pastor Michael paused for the smallest fraction of a second before quietly encouraging her to continue. That hesitation lasted less than a heartbeat, yet it stayed with me. I suddenly realized I was not imagining things. Someone else had recognized that those words were different. Still, the ceremony moved forward. Rings were exchanged. Applause filled the sanctuary. Friends and relatives stood to celebrate the newly married couple, while I remained seated for one extra moment, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. Had Olivia rewritten her own promises without telling Daniel, or had they both decided together that I no longer belonged in the future they were building? I smiled for every photograph, hugged every guest who congratulated me, and never allowed my confusion to reach my face. Deep inside, however, a quiet certainty had already taken root. The words I heard that afternoon were not spontaneous. They had been chosen with remarkable precision, and somehow I knew that the real story had only just begun. The reception was held in the ballroom of an old country club overlooking a quiet lake, the kind of place Richard always admired because it valued tradition without trying too hard to impress. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished wooden floors, and every centerpiece had been arranged exactly as I had requested months earlier. Laughter filled the room. Champagne glasses clinked together. Friends embraced relatives they had not seen in years. To everyone else, it looked like the beginning of a perfect marriage. I kept smiling because that was what mothers were expected to do. Every few minutes, someone stopped to compliment the ceremony or thank me for helping create such a beautiful day. I accepted every kind word with grace, but my thoughts never left the vows. They echoed inside my mind with uncomfortable clarity. The sentences that had sounded so deliberate. The brief glance Olivia had given me before reading them. The hesitation in Pastor Michael's voice. None of it fit together, yet none of it felt accidental either. During dinner, I watched Daniel and Olivia move from table to table greeting guests. Daniel laughed easily, completely unaware of the questions quietly growing inside me. Olivia appeared perfectly composed, thanking everyone for coming, posing for photographs, and speaking with effortless confidence. Every now and then she rested her hand on Daniel's arm, guiding him gently toward the next conversation as though she had already memorized every step of the evening. I noticed something else as well. Whenever someone mentioned family traditions or future holiday gatherings, Olivia answered before Daniel had the chance. She spoke warmly about building new customs, creating fresh memories, and focusing on the family they would create together. The words themselves sounded harmless. In fact, many people nodded with approval. But after hearing the vows, I could not ignore the pattern beginning to emerge. It was never about adding something new. It always seemed to involve quietly replacing something that already existed. After dinner, I stepped outside onto the stone terrace overlooking the water. The cool evening air offered a welcome escape from the music inside. I stood there for several minutes, watching gentle ripples move across the lake until I heard footsteps behind me. It was Pastor Michael. He offered a polite smile, but there was a heaviness in his eyes that had not been there earlier. We exchanged a few ordinary comments about the beautiful weather and the ceremony before an awkward silence settled between us. It felt as though both of us wanted to say something, but neither knew how to begin. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mrs. Brooks," he said quietly, "I hope today brought you some peace after everything you have been through this past year." I thanked him and started to turn back toward the ballroom when he added one more sentence that stopped me in my tracks. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "the words people choose tell us more than they ever intended." Before I could ask what he meant, another guest called his name from inside the reception hall. He excused himself with a courteous nod and disappeared through the glass doors, leaving me alone with those words. I did not chase after him. I did not confront Olivia. I simply stood beneath the evening sky, listening to the distant laughter inside the ballroom while a quiet certainty settled over me. Pastor Michael had noticed something too. He had not explained it, but he had confirmed that I was not imagining what happened at the altar. For the first time that day, I stopped asking myself whether the vows had been changed. Instead, I began asking a far more unsettling question. Who had wanted them changed badly enough to make certain no one would ever know? I returned to the reception as though nothing had changed. The band had begun playing soft jazz, couples were drifting onto the dance floor, and servers moved quietly between tables carrying slices of wedding cake. I congratulated relatives, smiled for more photographs, and thanked old family friends for making the trip. No one could have guessed that every pleasant conversation was happening against the backdrop of questions that refused to leave my mind. Richard had often reminded me that the truth had a peculiar habit of revealing itself when people believed they had successfully hidden it. For the first time since the ceremony began, I decided to stop searching for answers through emotion and start paying attention to facts. I watched carefully, without appearing to watch at all. Olivia remained confident throughout the evening. She greeted every guest with practiced warmth and somehow managed to keep Daniel constantly occupied. Whenever one of his cousins tried to pull him into a longer conversation, Olivia gently redirected him toward another group. Whenever his childhood friends invited him to the bar for a quick toast, she reminded him that the photographer wanted another set of pictures. None of those moments seemed inappropriate by themselves. They were small, ordinary, almost invisible. Yet together they created a quiet pattern that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Daniel never appeared to notice, because he trusted her completely. That realization saddened me more than anything else. My son was not acting differently because he had become uncaring. He simply believed everything unfolding around him was natural. As the evening continued, Grace Whitman found me standing beside the dessert table. Grace and I had been friends for nearly 30 years. She had celebrated anniversaries with Richard, attended Daniel's high school graduation, and stood beside me at Richard's funeral when I could barely remain on my feet. She knew my expressions almost as well as I did. She handed me a cup of coffee before quietly asking, "Something is bothering you, isn't it?" I hesitated for only a moment before admitting that the vows sounded different from the ones Daniel had proudly shared with me the night before. Grace did not dismiss my concern or tell me I was imagining things. Instead, she looked toward the dance floor where Daniel and Olivia were sharing their first dance as husband and wife. After several thoughtful seconds, she spoke so softly that I almost missed her words. I noticed the pastor looked surprised too. Hearing someone else confirm what I had seen sent a chill through me despite the warmth of the crowded ballroom. Grace continued carefully. She explained that during the rehearsal the previous afternoon, she had briefly walked past the front pews while searching for the restroom. She distinctly remembered hearing Daniel read a line thanking both families for shaping the people they had become. That sentence had never been spoken during the ceremony. She could not remember every detail, but she remembered enough to know something had changed. Neither of us rushed to conclusions. Neither of us accused anyone. We simply stood there, two women quietly comparing memories while laughter echoed around us. Before returning to her table, Grace gently squeezed my hand. "Do not let anyone convince you that your memory has failed," she whispered. "You heard what you heard." Those words stayed with me long after the reception ended. They did not provide proof, but they gave me something equally important. They reminded me that I was not alone. Somewhere between the rehearsal and the ceremony, the promises that were meant to unite two families had been quietly rewritten, and for reasons I still could not understand, at least 3 people now knew that the story everyone celebrated that evening was not the complete truth. I spent the next several days pretending that life had returned to normal. Daniel and Olivia left for a short honeymoon along the coast of Maine, and the house fell quiet again. I watered the flowers Richard had planted years earlier, folded the table linens from the reception, and placed the framed wedding photograph on the living room shelf beside an older picture of Daniel graduating from college. Anyone who visited would have seen a proud mother preserving another happy family memory. Only I knew that every time I looked at the photograph, my eyes drifted toward Olivia's calm expression, searching for an answer hidden behind a smile. On the 4th morning after the wedding, my telephone rang just after 9 o'clock. The voice on the other end belonged to Pastor Michael. He sounded courteous as always, but there was a hesitation that immediately caught my attention. He asked whether we could meet for coffee if I had time that afternoon. He did not explain why. He simply said there was something he believed I should know. We met at a small family-owned cafe, only a few blocks from the church. It was quiet, with only a handful of customers scattered near the windows. Pastor Michael arrived carrying a leather folder that looked familiar. After ordering coffee, neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, he folded his hands together and looked directly at me. "Mrs. Brooks," he began softly, "I have replayed the ceremony in my mind every day since Saturday." I remained silent, allowing him to continue at his own pace. He admitted that during the rehearsal Daniel had handed him one printed copy of the personal vows for reference. Church policy encouraged officiants to review personalized readings beforehand in case someone became emotional or lost their place. On the wedding day, however, Olivia approached him shortly before the ceremony with a revised packet. She explained that both she and Daniel had made a few last-minute adjustments together the previous evening and asked him to replace the original pages. Pastor Michael had no reason to doubt her. Couples often refined personal vows before the ceremony. Yet when Olivia began reading, he immediately realized several sentences were entirely different from the wording he remembered reviewing during rehearsal. He glanced toward Daniel, expecting confusion or surprise, but my son continued smiling naturally, as though he had heard those words before. That single detail troubled Pastor Michael more than anything else. "I wondered if perhaps they had practiced again without me," he admitted. "But when I saw your reaction, I realized someone else recognized the difference." My heartbeat slowed rather than quickened. Strangely, hearing his explanation did not make me angry. It made me thoughtful. There were only two possibilities. Either Daniel had knowingly approved every change without ever mentioning it to me, or he had never seen the revised version at all. Pastor Michael carefully opened the leather folder resting beside him. Inside were several ceremony notes, including a photocopy of the rehearsal outline. He turned a page and pointed to a highlighted section. There, written in Daniel's own handwriting, was the sentence Grace remembered hearing during rehearsal, the same sentence thanking both families for shaping the people they had become. It was missing entirely from the ceremony. Pastor Michael closed the folder, without handing it to me. "I cannot accuse anyone of wrongdoing," he said gently. "But I believe you deserve to know that your memory was correct." As I walked back to my car that afternoon, I no longer questioned whether the vows had been altered. That mystery had been settled. The only question left was far more difficult to answer. If Daniel never approved those changes, who had made certain he would never realize they existed until it was far too late? I did not call Daniel the moment I returned home. For nearly 2 days, I allowed every new piece of information to settle before deciding what to do next. Richard always believed that important conversations should begin only after emotions had finished speaking. I tried to follow that advice, even though patience felt heavier than ever. On Sunday afternoon, my phone finally rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and hearing his familiar voice immediately reminded me of the little boy who used to tell me every detail about his day before I even asked. He sounded cheerful. He and Olivia had just returned from Maine, and he wanted to stop by with a small gift they had picked up during their trip. I welcomed them as warmly as I always had. We shared coffee in the kitchen, admired photographs of rocky coastlines and quiet lighthouses, and listened as Daniel described long walks along the ocean. Olivia smiled politely, adding small details whenever the conversation slowed. From the outside, everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Yet I noticed that every time Daniel began remembering the wedding ceremony itself, Olivia gently redirected the conversation toward the honeymoon instead. After nearly an hour, Olivia excused herself to answer a telephone call outside on the back patio. The moment the sliding glass door closed behind her, I quietly reached into the dining room cabinet and removed the envelope that Daniel had left with me before the wedding rehearsal. I placed it carefully on the kitchen table between us. Daniel looked at it with immediate recognition. "You kept it," he said with a smile. I nodded. "Would you read your vows for me one more time?" He looked surprised but agreed, without hesitation. He unfolded the pages and began reading aloud. Every sentence matched the version I remembered. Every promise was filled with gratitude, kindness, and respect for the family that had raised both of them. When he finished, I waited several seconds before asking the question that had lived inside me since the ceremony. "Daniel," I said gently, "are those exactly the words you spoke at the altar?" His smile faded. He looked back at the papers in his hands, then at me. "Of course they are," he answered confidently. I quietly repeated 2 of the sentences Olivia had spoken during the ceremony, including the one about leaving behind the expectations of previous generations. Daniel frowned almost immediately. "Mom, I never wrote that." He shook his head before I had even finished repeating the second sentence. That does not sound like anything I would say. I watched confusion slowly replace certainty across his face. Without saying another word, I walked to the bookshelf in the living room and retrieved the wedding video company brochure that listed online access for preview clips before the final edited film was delivered. During the reception, the videographer had mentioned that short rehearsal footage would also be available to the family once everything had been uploaded. Daniel stared at the brochure as though trying to remember the conversation. "There should be rehearsal recordings," he murmured quietly. "They filmed everything while testing the cameras." Just then Olivia returned to the kitchen carrying her coffee cup. She looked from me to Daniel, noticing the envelope resting open on the table. For the briefest moment her expression changed. It was gone almost instantly, replaced by the same composed smile she had worn throughout the wedding. "What are you two talking about?" she asked lightly. Daniel answered before I could speak. "Mom thinks the vows sounded different during the ceremony." Olivia gave a small laugh that sounded almost effortless. "Everyone is emotional at weddings. Memories can play tricks on us." I did not argue. I simply looked at Daniel, whose eyes remained fixed on the pages in his hands instead of on his wife. For the first time since the ceremony, I saw uncertainty settle quietly across his face, and I realized that whatever happened next would no longer depend on what I remembered. It would depend on what the evidence was about to reveal. I did not contact the videographer immediately. Instead, I waited until the following morning, wanting to approach everything with a clear mind. The company responded faster than I expected. Their coordinator explained that the complete wedding film would take several weeks to finish, but the rehearsal footage had already been uploaded for backup purposes. She sent Daniel a private viewing link because he was listed as the primary client. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. His voice sounded quieter than I had ever heard it. He asked if I could come to his house that evening because there was something we needed to watch together. When I arrived, Daniel was already sitting in the living room with his laptop open on the coffee table. Olivia was preparing dinner in the kitchen, humming softly as though it were any ordinary weekday. Daniel waited until she stepped outside to take a delivery before pressing the play button. The rehearsal began exactly as I remembered. Family members laughed as everyone practiced walking down the aisle. The wedding coordinator adjusted bouquets and reminded people where to stand. Then came the moment Daniel stepped forward to rehearse his personal vows. He unfolded the same pages that still rested safely inside my dining room cabinet. Every sentence matched the version he had read to me after returning from his honeymoon. Every word was sincere. Every promise honored both the marriage he was beginning and the family that had helped shape him. Daniel paused the video and looked at me without speaking. Neither of us needed to say anything because we both understood what we had just confirmed. Then he pressed play again. A few minutes later, the cameras continued recording while the coordinator asked everyone to take a short break before practicing the exchange of rings. Most guests wandered toward the church entrance. Daniel stepped outside with two friends. The camera remained running near the altar, capturing the quiet sanctuary almost by accident. That was when Olivia approached Pastor Michael carrying a different set of printed pages. Although the microphone was several feet away, parts of the conversation could still be heard. Olivia calmly explained that she and Daniel had agreed to make a few final improvements after discussing the ceremony again that evening. Pastor Michael accepted the papers without hesitation and thanked her for bringing the updated copy before the wedding day. There was no argument, no secret meeting,
no dramatic confrontation.
Only a brief exchange built entirely upon trust. Daniel replayed that section 3 times. His hands rested motionless on the edge of the laptop. Finally, he whispered, almost to himself, "I never had that conversation." The room fell completely silent. A few seconds later, Olivia walked back inside carrying 2 grocery bags. She immediately noticed the paused image on the screen showing her standing beside the pastor. Her smile disappeared for only an instant before she quietly set the bags on the kitchen counter. Daniel looked at her with confusion rather than anger. "Did we change the vows together?" he asked gently. Olivia did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the frozen image on the screen and took a slow breath. "I only adjusted a few sentences," she said calmly. "I thought they reflected our future better." Daniel lowered his eyes to the laptop before speaking again. You told Pastor Michael that I approved every change. This time Olivia remained silent. No explanation came. No denial followed. In that long, quiet moment, the truth finally became impossible to hide. It was not the missing sentences that hurt my son the most. It was discovering that the first promise broken in his marriage had happened before the ceremony had even begun. I left Daniel's house that evening with an unexpected sense of calm. For days I had believed the greatest wound came from hearing unfamiliar words spoken at the altar. I was wrong. The deepest wound had been watching my son discover that trust could disappear so quietly. I did not feel victorious, because there was nothing to celebrate. Families are not strengthened when someone is proven right. They are tested by what they choose to do after the truth has finally come into the light. Daniel called me the following afternoon and asked if I would meet him at the small park where Richard used to take him fishing as a little boy. The lake looked exactly as it had decades earlier, peaceful enough to make every conversation feel slower and more honest. We sat together on the same wooden bench where Richard once taught Daniel how patience often revealed more than force ever could. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "Mom, I keep replaying everything in my head," he admitted quietly. "I trusted someone I loved, and I never imagined I should verify something as personal as my own vows." I placed my hand gently over his. "Trust is not foolish," I told him. "It is one of the greatest gifts we can offer another person." The mistake was never trusting. The mistake was allowing someone to believe that trust meant they never had to be truthful. He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the water. Then he surprised me. "I owe you an apology." Those words carried more weight than he probably realized. He apologized for dismissing my memory, for assuming emotion had clouded my judgment, and for failing to notice the quiet ways I had been pushed aside during the wedding. I accepted his apology without hesitation because resentment had never been my goal. Richard always believed forgiveness was strongest when it was offered freely instead of demanded. A few days later, Daniel told me he had begun having difficult but respectful conversations with Olivia about honesty, communication, and the foundation of their marriage. Those conversations belonged to them, and I never asked for details. Their relationship would only survive if they learned to face one another with complete honesty. That was never a lesson I could teach for them. It was one they had to choose together. As for me, life slowly settled into a quieter rhythm. I continued tending Richard's garden, meeting Grace for coffee every Thursday afternoon, and attending church each Sunday, where Pastor Michael always greeted me with the same gentle smile. One morning I opened the drawer containing Daniel's original handwritten vows. I read them one final time before placing them back inside the envelope. I no longer kept them as evidence. I kept them as a reminder that sincere words still existed, even if they had not been spoken when they should have been. Months later, the completed wedding video arrived. I watched it alone in my living room. The ceremony looked beautiful. The music was perfect. The flowers were exactly where they belonged. Anyone seeing it for the first time would have believed it was a flawless beginning. I quietly turned off the television before the closing credits appeared. I had already learned the lesson that mattered most. A wedding is remembered for its flowers, photographs, and celebrations only for a little while. It is remembered for its promises for the rest of a lifetime. Promises are not meaningful because they are spoken before witnesses. They are meaningful because they reveal the character of the person speaking them. On that autumn afternoon, the words that were changed did not define the future of my family. The choices that followed did. And sometimes the strongest way to protect the people you love is not by speaking louder than everyone else, but by remaining patient until the truth has enough room to speak for itself.